Holly.
Hello, Dave.
Welcome to the What Difference Does It Make podcast. How are you today?
Can I say great? I am great today. I've been working on new adjectives, but today I'm great.
Today you are great. I should say hello because, it's Hello is a song from 1984.
Hello, is it me you're looking for?
We've been talking about 1984 all year long. We start off our year 2021 talking about 1984. I invite people to go check out the list of songs that we discussed in 1984. It was good to see that this author, Michaelangelo Matos, has a book that actually came out this year called Can't Slow Down, How 1984 Became Pop's Blockbuster Year. And he kind of covers significant episodes that happened in the year 1984.
Oh yeah, he nailed the significant episodes, and he gives a lot of good information. I'll learn some things I did not know about 1984.
It's going to be good to talk to Michaelangelo about radio and about MTV.
And we would love it if you would check out our YouTube channel where we are adding clips pretty much every day of past episodes. And from this particular episode with Michaelangelo Matos, some of what you don't hear in the podcast, you will see on YouTube. So check it out.
So why don't we just jump right into it now, Holly?
Let's do it, and welcome Michaelangelo Matos.
Hello.
Hello.
You've got this book. It's called Can't Slow Down, How 1984 Became Pop's Blockbuster Year. I loved how you started off in the introduction with the introduction of like, I'm 9 years old. I'm listening to the radio. You're just starting out. And what did you discover at 9 years old when listening to, and what was that radio station? And what were your
Well, it was two radio stations.
Yeah.
It was two, because I was going back and forth, just like twisting the dial to avoid commercials. They were WLOL and KDWB. I didn't just become a music fan at 9. I was a music fan from really, really, really early. My uncle was a DJ. I was obsessed with his records. I had a Fisher-Price record player when I was 5. And, I was a huge music fan always, since I can remember. And so that day was more that I realized after the fact that 84 was a peak year because, that day sort of set it in stone. And I remember especially, I wrote about this only tangentially in the intro, that when I was 10, in 85, I could hear the utter drop off in quality on the radio. Pop radio just like hit the toilet in 85 and stayed that way for a lot of the rest of the 80s, despite whatever, nostalgia people have. What I remember vividly is how bad things got after that. And I remember how bad things were before it too. I was paying really close attention as a kid I listened to Casey Kasem every week, like religiously. I didn't like have a notebook with the charts in it, but I was always fascinated by them. I would write things out a lot. I remember once when I was a kid, I was at my at a relative's house that I used to stay at on weekends, and I decided I was going to make a list of every song ever.
Yeah,
every single one.
That's what you do.
I got to about 200 before I gave up. And that was well before 84. That was earlier. That was a moment where I just realized this is really happening. All these songs are great. This is, when you're 9, you're not thinking like a cultural theorist, but it was along those lines.
Where'd you grow up? What city are you in at 9?
I was in Richfield, which is a first ring suburb of Minneapolis. And that was a big part of it too, because I was living in the Twin Cities, and 84 is of course Purple Rain fever. And it's not just that, it's all sorts of fever. But that was the situation then, was just knowing how good radio was compared to how it had been just a couple of years earlier when it was all Air Supply. Yeah. And it was all power ballads and adult contemporary, and very, very, it was very white. It was very dull. And I had always been a fan of R&B and funk and disco. And my uncle that I mentioned, who was a DJ, he was a dance music, he was a funk DJ. And I would just pour over his records. So, I was already sort of a lifer in that, in a sense, but I sort of got out of music from 85 through maybe 87 because the radio just stunk.
How aware were you of the music scene outside of Minneapolis?
I wasn't aware of the music scene in Minneapolis. Again, I was a kid. I didn't know about local bands at all. I didn't know how any of that worked. I just knew the radio. And I knew MTV a little bit too. We didn't have cable then, but I'd go to Chuck E. Cheese on weekends and sit, and I didn't want to play the video games. I wanted to sit in the dark room and watch the videos.
Yeah.
So I wasn't really aware of anything beyond Prince and his whole thing. And I knew what First Avenue was because of the movie, of course, but I didn't know very much at all. I didn't know anything about the Replacements and Husker Du and any of that stuff. Punk, to me as a kid, and I make a joke about this in the first chapter, to me, punks were like scary.
Yeah.
Punks were the people who killed each other on Quincy.
Yeah. And they did. So going a 9-year-old who's listening to Prince, was it just unfiltered? Like, okay, I got this album and you're listening to it. And despite Tipper Gore in Minneapolis, despite Tipper Gore saying you should not be listening, 9-year-old should not be listening to this, you still got your hands on it.
I had a very unfiltered upbringing, which is bad in a lot of ways, honestly. But I also had a very strong fandom of him from the time I was a kid. My whole family was obsessed with him. Everybody in all of my mom's relatives and my mom and I were all just huge fans, huge fans. And we were all huge fans well before Purple Rain. The thing that something I've talked about a lot, I haven't written really about it at all, but something that I've always thought, and this is sort of corroborated by a lot of people, the most Minneapolis Prince album is Controversy. Controversy is the album where everybody in the Twin Cities got on board. I Want to Be Your Lover was a pop hit, but it didn't get played on pop radio in the Twin Cities until after it was a national hit. And this is when that was a much more commonplace thing. It wasn't all one network being programmed by a central computer. There were, people were lamenting, and again, I talk about this in the book, but people were lamenting the fact that they were using call-out research, using computers to program top 40 radio. People thought that sucked. It lacked the personal touch, etc. If only they'd known what it would become. But Dirty Mind was such a big critical hit, and it was a big cult hit. And Controversy takes the ideas of Dirty Mind and expands them and makes them a little less, confrontational and a little more user-friendly. And that was the album that everybody around me when I was 6, 7 years old was obsessed with. Sometimes it was just because of the poster of him in the shower with a pair of bikini briefs. Some of it was Do Me Baby, the ultimate slow jam. There were all kinds of reasons, but that's the one that I most strongly identify with as a Minneapolis album. And so I was already a huge fan. Everybody I knew, everybody in my family, a lot of my friends were fans. And then when Purple Rain hit, we were all like, well, yeah, duh.
In your first chapter, we talk about WPLJ, which was a AOR station.
Yes.
And they discover, just like a 9-year-old, there's a lot of pop hits, and this is where our radio station should go.
And they were late doing it. They did it months after, 7 or 8 months after most of the AORs in America were doing it, because AOR had hit the wall. Let me go back a little bit because the context will help. AOR had started in 1971. It was basically invented by Lee Abrams, the consultant, who I think he was 17 at the time. And he had a very narrow definition of what rock radio should be. He was taking freeform FM, which was playing any damn thing in the world that the DJ wanted to play, and he narrowed it decisively. He made it very much about what the program director at WPLJ called white men with long hair playing guitars. Rock for a long time had been integrated music, to use Daryl Hall's term. What Daryl Hall said was rock and roll wasn't white music and it wasn't black music, it was integrated music. And then it became unintegrated music. Jack Hamilton, who writes for Slate, has a great book called Just Around Midnight about how that shift occurred during the 60s, how in 1960, Chuck Berry was the archetypal rock and roller, a black man with a guitar. And by 1969, Jimi Hendrix was an atypical rock and roller because he was a black man with a guitar. And a lot of things changed around then, but radio basically took that as gospel. By 1979, by 1980, 81, you didn't hear any Black people on AOR radio except for Hendrix and Thin Lizzy, pretty much. And there were a lot of stations that were playing Black rock, playing Funkadelic, playing, Earth, Wind and Fire and the Isley Brothers, bands with guitars, bands that played bitchin' solos. They just kept narrowing the focus. When punk comes along, there's a wholesale rejection of it. It doesn't fit the parameters. It doesn't sound airbrushed like Boston. It doesn't have the multi-tracked guitars and that sweet sonic center. It doesn't have that like pseudo-operatic feel. And it painted itself into a corner because by 1981, 82, most of the big bands that had dominated AOR had broken up, gone completely soft. I mean, most of those artists were not making good music or even making, music that could fit the format as anything other than just like legacy. So, and I'm sorry to be windy about this, but, it helps because by 1982, it's very apparent that the hard rockin' white guy thing has hit the wall and AOR is losing its audience because they have narrowcasted it so definitively as just for young white men, young white working class men. They don't have any other reach. Radio is doing this all around. All kinds of formats are segregating themselves and narrowing their focus. But AOR had been so big for so long, and then suddenly the ratings are tanking. The stations are shutting down or changing. And Lee Abrams, who is consulting a bunch of these stations, basically, telling them what to play, he suddenly has a come to Jesus moment because between the narrowing of that format and the rise of MTV, where suddenly there's something like a national radio station for the first time, and guess what they're playing? They're playing British New Wave, the very music that Lee Abrams won't let his stations play, and they're taking it to the bank. It's burying AOR. The British New Wave bands, the synth pop bands, Duran Duran, Human League, that's all huge. And suddenly AOR, which had been like the epitome of hip for so long, is suddenly the most unhip thing there is. And Top 40 is hip. So Top 40 resurges because of MTV and Michael Jackson. And when Beat It comes out, that's it. AOR has to play it. He made the track for AOR. Eddie Van Halen is soloing on the track. How does AOR not play it? So they have to. And then suddenly the ratings go up. People who are not just young white working class men are listening to this stuff. There's money to be made. So there is a real sense of we are on a dying horse here and we need to change in midstream. So they did for about 2 years. And that's the period that I cover in the book.
I guess MTV has a huge influence on this. I mean, as you say this, it's like, well, it's no coincidence that MTV came around in 81 and then started playing, well, sometimes segregated music, but still they were playing
incredibly segregated music. MTV, what's the figure? I think I had like 29 black videos out of 750 in its first 2 years, something like that. Yeah. No R&B really at all. Like it's the busboys basically. So MTV is decisive and it changes everything.
They were at first only playing the artists that were making videos. This is who they were getting videos. It wasn't narrow casting. It was what was available to them. They were just putting it out there. Right.
It's a kind of narrow casting. But the other thing to understand about MTV is that it modeled itself on an AOR station. It modeled itself on AOR, but it didn't have the stuff that AOR had. They didn't have videos for Zeppelin. One video that they put in microwave rotation really early on is the Springsteen Rosalita from Live in Arizona in '78, which is one of the just greatest things ever. Just everything about it. I played that for somebody, and somebody who I knew had no real idea what he was like. And the second it began, she was like, "Oh my God, he's so hot!" I was like, "Yep." Like just keep watching. You'll see how hot he is. Like because the girl comes up and all these women come up to kiss him. And at the end, this girl comes up and just like kisses him for 2 minutes. But that was something that they could play over and over and over again because there were no Springsteen videos per se. They didn't have videos for all of the artists they wanted to be playing. And it turned out that what people liked, what the kids watching this liked were the new wave videos. They had way more of those anyway, but it was also just more popular with kids. They were into it. It was different. It wasn't old guy rock.
We are talking with Michaelangelo Matos about the year 1984. That was the year that can't slow down, as Lionel Richie once said. But we slow down when it's break time, and that's where we have arrived at this moment.
Welcome back to the What Difference Does It Make podcast and our guest, Michaelangelo Matos.
In 1983, that was when the Brits took over again. You have a chapter, January 23rd, or what was the significance of that date, January 23rd, 84?
That's the cover date of Newsweek.
That's right. Okay. Right. Where they determined.
Newsweek puts Boy George and Annie Lennox of the Eurythmics on the cover. Boy George of Culture Club, Annie Lennox of the Eurythmics. And of course, today, people don't even know the bands. They just know the artists. They know them as solo artists or as personalities.
Yeah.
I guess personality in Boy George's case, solo artist in Annie Lennox's case. But yeah, at the time they were the faces of MTV. When I was figuring out how to write this book, which took years, figuring it out took years, much less writing it. I knew right away that was where I would peg the second British invasion.
So talking about your start to the book, how did you, obviously, the 1984, I understand how you feel about 1984 being a turning point or an ending point or turning point. What was the impetus for the book? Had this been, how long did it take to coalesce?
I had the idea first in 2009. I was flying from New York to Seattle, where I lived at the time, and it just hit me. I'm sitting on the plane, and all of a sudden it's like, oh, I should write a book about that year. A year of, I'm obsessed with that year in pop. What I always saw it as was a story. I always saw it as the story of an era. Because it was sprawling and because I kind of resisted that for a long time. What people who sell books will tell you, people who edit books and sell them will tell you that you need one focus, you need to have one central character in the narrative or something. And it's like, I've read so many music books like that are unsatisfying to me because they do that, because they are so, we're going to tell the story through one person, which can be a great way to do it. But like, oftentimes it feels like you really want to tell something bigger and more sprawling and frankly, more interesting. And it took me a long time to sort of admit to myself that that's really what I wanted to do. That's what I had to do in order to write the book I wanted to write, was to take the whole thing on. Not to focus on one thing and follow it through, but to write something more close to an aerial overview. Because I realized I'm not telling a story, I'm painting a canvas. This is a landscape. It's a portrait of an era. It's intentionally broad and intentionally sweeping. A friend of mine gave me some advice really right after I started thinking about this. He's like, the people reading this book will never have walked into a record store. And that made it incumbent upon me, if I'm going to explain how, I'm trying to explain how the music business worked at the time, the whole music business outside of classical. Mm-hmm. And once I started looking at the events, the sort of dates that I peg things to, I realized everything's here pretty much. I thought, I'm not going to be writing about jazz. And then I see the Grammys. It's like, of course I'm going to write about jazz. Because that's where, there's Herbie Hancock performing, there's Wynton Marsalis performing and causing controversy in both cases. And, there's a lot of rich stuff there. And once I got into it, it was just like the research took over. People have asked me a little bit like, what was surprising to you about writing this? And the answer is that everything you read in the book practically was surprising, and because that's why it's in the book. It's in the book because I was amazed by it, because I didn't know it. I didn't want to write a book about stuff everybody knew and just fill it with gossip and quips. There's a real sense, too, that anybody who writes about 80s music should be funny all the time, that it's nothing but a joke, and that everybody who writes about it should just make jokes. And no, nobody would say that about a book about 60s music.
That's true.
But I think a lot of it does have to do with MTV. But there were these big personalities there. You had your Cyndi Laupers and Michael Jackson and Prince, and it all came together at Radio City Music Hall for the first annual MTV Awards. I mean,
right.
Yeah. And watching that, it's kind of like this explosion of like all this great music coming together at once. And I don't think it's ever happened again.
That's right. I mean, I think it's happened again in more limited fashion in certain ways, but it hasn't happened like that again for sure. And the thing about the first MTV, the Video Music Awards, is that I watched it, and we didn't have MTV at the time. It was syndicated. They syndicated a 2-hour edit of the show for regular TV. It appeared on regular TV within a week. So I watched it then and was sort of like, whoa, look at all this. Again, MTV was really decisive and really major, but it also wasn't everywhere. Less than half of America was even wired for cable at that point. The Video Music Awards had a much broader reach than the rest of MTV simply because they had syndicated it.
And now I'm curious to know now what a syndicated version, what an edited down version would have looked like.
You still got to see.
I think they would probably have cut the part where Madonna's underwear shows.
I was about to say that. Like that was the controversial thing. I mean, I think Madonna said her career was over, or a lot of people thought her career was over once she flashed her underwear on that show.
Yeah, and it was an accident, of course.
Yeah.
But it was unprecedented. Even I don't think anybody had really done that. No woman had done that, let's say. Because the thing about early Madonna is that she gets brickbats, sexist brickbats, for the very things, and other people pointed this out many times at the time, or not even many people. Dave Marsh pointed it out, and almost nobody else did right away. Nothing she did was all that different from anything Mick Jagger had been doing for decades at that point.
Yeah, so true. There was a format that pretty much it broke in '84. This is hip hop.
Yes.
This was the year of breaking, and I think Run DMC.
Break the exploitation film.
Right. Well, that's when you know it hits the big time. Is when you get those movies, those exploitation films. Like this is the whole country will embrace this. Can you touch on what was it? Graffiti Rock, I think, is your chapter.
Yeah, that's right. Graffiti Rock is the focus of the chapter. And I was fortunate to talk to Michael Holman, the host and producer and creator of the show. I found him through Facebook. So Graffiti Rock, was a pilot. There was only one episode made. It was a half-hour show. It was basically American Bandstand for rap. And it was called rap then. Nobody referred to it as hip hop back then.
Now is the time for all the people all over the world to see rappers, breaking, DJ stars rocking, shaking and breaking. It's gonna give you a shock if you've never seen a break and do a head spin. Just check out this. And if you've never seen a DJ scratch a record on beat, just check out this. So bring your hats, your stage, your tightest band jeans, cause we're gonna rock the graffiti rock scene. Action!
It's Graffiti Rock. Graffiti Rock is like, Holman is seeing this whole thing blow up because he manages the New York City Breakers, which is a breakdancing crew. And he's shooting segments of these guys for like PM Magazine and all these syndicated and local like magazine style shows that used to proliferate back then, mostly syndicated. And so he was seeing all of this. He'd been a big part of that culture. He was somebody who was entrenched in it and knew it. And he was watching it blow up person by person, crowd by crowd, city by city. Nobody in corporate America was ready to believe that yet, even though it was obviously happening. Everybody but the radio knew it was happening. Everybody but the record business knew it was happening, pretty much. He's like, we're going to get on this wave and we're going to sell this show. And he makes the show. And it was like, oh, this is perfect. This is a perfect frame because you have the old school, which is the Treacherous 3 or the Treacherous 2, because the third member had left. There are conflicting opinions on whether he left or was kicked out. LA Sunshine. They're the hosts of the show along with Holman. Run DMC is upending rap. They come along with their drum machines and they're yelling. They're completely non-disco sound. And nowadays people refer to the early hip hop records as disco rap, which makes sense. Nobody called it that then, but that's pretty much what it was. they came along with their drum machines and their yelling, and they bulldozed, they rendered irrelevant all hip hop before them, which is a rare thing to do. A rare thing to do in any category, especially one that moves as fast as hip hop. And of course, within 4 years, they were has-beens, just like the groups that they had supplanted. But at that time, they were it. I remember hearing them in, like, I lived in an apartment complex, and I would hang out hang out around there, and like kids would have, there'd be a playground, and like kids had boom boxes, and that's where I heard Run DMC. I was like, what the hell is this? Everybody did. Everybody who heard Run DMC for the first time in 1983, 84 was like, what the hell is this?
Yeah.
You had Shannon, the disco singer. You had the breakdancing crews. You had people scratching records. You had the whole culture on display in a half hour for middle America's consumption. And that seemed to me the perfect frame.
Yeah, I can imagine what living in Minneapolis and hearing King of Rock or what, like
suburban Minneapolis.
Yeah, like, wow. I mean, that's great that it got to you. Like with all great books, you have a great finale that it builds and builds and builds. I mean, we have, Band-Aid goes into We Are the World, goes into Live Aid, and then as according to your book, that's it. Decades or 80s are over right after a Live Aid.
I didn't say the 80s were over. The 80s, that's Marco Peroni from Adam and the Ants who said that I quote in the intro. I mean, in a way, what happens after 84, after Live Aid, is even more 80s in that sense.
Well, that's true. Yeah.
It's what had come before amplified. You want big hair, we're going to give you bigger hair. Yeah. You want airbrushed sounding drums, we're going to really make them sound airbrushed. Or gated, rather. I wrote something after I was done with the book that ran in the Wire magazine about gated drums, which is where they basically, you hit the drum and it has room echo, and the gate cuts the echo off. So instead of a natural reverberation, it goes, that sound. You think of like the early comeback Aerosmith songs, like Love in an Elevator with that boom sound. And so the later 80s are an amplification and formularization of what's happening earlier in the decade. For me, 84 is such a peak because there's both the surging sense that pop music is fun, interesting, and worth being challenging with again. And there's also the sense of we got to make this accessible to it. So it's like the perfect combination of experimentation and accessibility. Whereas later, all the experimentation goes out the window or goes into underground music. It goes into indie rock. It goes into hip hop. It goes into dance music. What
led Bob Geldof to get all these people together and then, and then develop? It just kind of escalated. It was insane.
Yeah, and that's what it was. It was never a grand master plan. He wanted to do the Band-Aid single and be done. He wanted to go back to the Boomtown Rats because they had an album that he needed to promote. And instead what had happened is that he, like a lot of people in Britain, had seen the BBC report on Ethiopia in October of that year. And that, the famine was going on, and the images at that point, people had not seen images like that on television of children literally starving. It was shocking to him. It was like nobody had seen that sort of thing, and much less thousands and thousands of kids like that. So it stirred him to action. He decided, you know what, I'm going to make a record. And his idea at first, I think, was just to have like a handful of stars. It was just going to be like 5 or 6 people. When I forget who it was exactly, but I remember in that chapter about Band-Aids, Do They Know It's Christmas? There were people who arrived at the studio thinking there was just going to be 3 or 4 people. They weren't expecting everybody. Right. And he was going after as many people as he could, mostly, I think, because he just figured, I'm going to aim as widely as I can so that we can, even if we get like 10%, that's plenty. But he didn't get 10%. He got a lot more. But all of them had seen the report too.
Yeah. So
all these people had seen that, were horrified, genuinely horrified. People were not inured to that kind of suffering the way they are now. People now are so used to seeing that sort of thing, so used to seeing the devastation of famine and war and the horrible things that governments do to their own people, that we've become blasé about it. And that didn't exist then.
So he puts this together. Was like Bob Geldof's ego, or what was it that's like, okay, we did this, everyone's into it.
No, I would say the opposite. I would say, I would really, I don't think ego really fit into this at all. I don't think there was any ego involved. I think it was the opposite. He was not doing this for his career. If he wanted to like tend to his career, he would have ignored it. He was already in the middle of a career slide that he was trying to reverse because he had put out a Boomtown Rats album. There's a footnote in the Live Aid chapter about he had a single called Dave that the American record company made him change the lyrics to because it was a song of empathy for a gay friend. And they made him change the lyrics so that it wasn't about a gay person. And it flopped anyway. He was trying to do things to help his own career in terms of his own career, but they weren't taking. This took off. But it wasn't, I'm positive he did not see this as a career move. It became very commonplace to say that. There was a lot of cynicism because, again, this is beyond the scope of the book. By the late 80s, by the early 90s, you think of like, we're sending our love down the well from The Simpsons is sort of the ultimate parody of that whole era of charity rock. Because it became a whole thing. There were all these tours and all these charity records and all these fundraising records, in all genres and all styles. Do you know about Hearing Aid?
I vaguely.
HEAR-N aid.
Okay.
It was the heavy metal We Are the World.
That's right.
It's amazing. It's hilarious.
Prize for the children.
There's dozens of those, dozens. And they proliferated throughout the second half of the 80s, and people got compassion. Pop music kind of got in, or pop fans, pop intelligentsia, let's say, got a very bad case of compassion fatigue by 1990 or so, because there were so many of these things. So Live Aid and Band Aid and USA for Africa presaged a lot of things. There were tons of those. It became kind of a fad, and people were just like, we're sick of this. It's all Bob Geldof's fault.
You mentioned Dave and, them removing a gay slur or what, mentioning a reference. But 84 was also the year of gay awareness. Like, Frankie Goes to Hollywood, right. Bronski Beat.
Yes,
absolutely. There was a lot of that music.
And the signal moment is Boy George essentially announcing that he's gay on the Grammy Awards. Maybe not announcing that he's gay, but, saying it with a wink. It helps also to understand just how, we were not a connected society digitally at that point. One thing that was a big deal about Live Aid is that it was the most advanced technological TV special to that point. It was near simultaneously live. There was maybe a second long delay, which was unheard of at that point. Broadcasting live from London to Philadelphia and back, that was completely unprecedented. It didn't exist to the point that we have now where everything is very instantaneous and small. At that point, everything was big and lumbering. The lack of connectedness meant that in Britain, Boy George was well known as queer. In America, he could fool people into thinking he wasn't. And the same for Boy George, in fact. So on the Grammy Awards, when, Culture Club is accepting its Best New Artist award, Boy George says to America,
"Thank you, America. You've got taste, style, and you know a good drag queen when you see one."
Talking about me.
And his manager is said to have dropped his cigar. There was a firestorm as big as the one surrounding Madonna's underwear. Suddenly, suddenly Culture Club records were getting banned at like Bible colleges. He had presented himself for so long as this cuddly, lovable, harmless creature, whereas in Britain, he was known as, a nightlife sybarite.
It's crazy. Yeah. I mean, it stopped Elton John's career for a bit. And so, America.
Earlier on, in 76. That's right.
Yeah. So
he admitted he was bisexual in a Rolling Stone interview.
Yeah. I had no idea George Michael was gay. I had no idea, Freddie Mercury, these guys, they kept it under wraps for a long time.
There's a great book by the British writer David Hepworth called Uncommon People, The Rise and Fall of the Rock Stars. And the Freddie Mercury chapter is heartbreaking. The end of the Freddie Mercury chapter is heartbreaking. The last line is, after he died, his parents hadn't even known he was gay. That's how people didn't pick up on those signals back then. People were not code aware the way they are now.
Yeah, I wasn't until you look back at it and you watch Freddie Mercury in his short shorts. Like, why didn't I notice this? It is so obvious now.
They're called Queen.
Yeah, I know. Well, there was that too.
We were just young and unaware.
I know.
And the times.
Made fun.
There was an oral history of the song YMCA in Spin magazine, say in the early 2000s. And there's all these sports people who are like, the Village People were gay?
Yeah.
YMCA?
Yeah.
For God's sake.
I wanted to hang out with all the boys. I mean, what's wrong with that? It's wonderful.
Just like my own curiosity. So the way you laid out the book is very, very interesting. I love that, I like the chapters, the locations, the way you set it up. But I am sure that there were I don't know how you keyed in on each one, but you must have had to eliminate a whole host, right?
I didn't eliminate any of the chapters. No, I eliminated a lot of writing. I wrote I wrote sizable sections on lots of artists that I just cut. Like there were lots of people that I wanted to cover, lots of things that I wanted to cover. And, I write long and cut. The original draft of this book is 2.5 times longer than the book. It was true also of my previous book, The Underground is Massive. You're dealing with a big topic and you're dealing with a sprawling history with lots of characters and lots of personalities and lots of events. Something's got to go. And so I can tell you what I cut. There were loads of things. I had a section on Janet Jackson eloping with James DeBarge. I had to cut all of the DeBarge stuff. I had to cut all the Janet stuff. It's important historically because it's what leads to Control in her big solo career.
Yeah.
But it just didn't fit. I cut the indie rock chapter was going to end on Sonic Youth, and I cut that. I cut a section on the Go-Betweens from the British invasion chapter that didn't, again, too small, didn't really fit, not enough. The chapter on Island Records, which is a favorite chapter of mine as well. That chapter is keyed to the release of Bob Marley's Legend, the biggest selling compilation of all time, one of the biggest selling records of all time, probably the biggest selling record of 1984, bigger than Springsteen, bigger than Prince, bigger than Madonna. And I'm a big African music fan. I'm a big fan, particularly of Congolese soukous or rumba, just some of my favorite music. And two of my favorite performers are two of the biggest performers of that music, and they were Franco and Taboulé Rochereau. And the two of them made a pair of albums together. And I had a big 2,500 word section on them, and I had to cut it because it was just like, this isn't going to fit. This just isn't going to fit. You have to include Fela Kuti. I had to include King Sunny Ade. And I'm really glad I got all of that in there. Yeah. Really glad. But I couldn't include Franco and Rochereau. I will say, though, that piece is going to appear in the next issue of Maggot Brain magazine, which Third Man Records publishes. It's edited by my friend Mike McGonigal. So I'm happy to say that that's going to make an appearance in public soon. I didn't talk about Luther Vandross. I didn't talk about a lot of non-crossover R&B. Crossover is sort of the key word for the book because this was the era of high crossover all over the place. That's why it was important to include a country chapter, because Willie Nelson was the king of crossover, or a king of crossover. Crossover was the word. Crossover was the move at the time. People were into the idea of going pop and crossing audiences and mixing things up in a way that circumvented the increasing polarization, both of pop music and of America under Reagan. It behooved me to concentrate on those figures, even though I had lots of stuff, lots of great stuff. Here's a thing that I had to leave out that I think you'll find interesting. I had to leave out a lot of stuff about how soundtracks worked. For example, one reason that soundtracks sold so well in the 80s is because of the rise of shopping malls. Theaters and stores were now 50 feet from one another. So much like you would buy a magazine in the aisle or a piece of candy in the aisle, in the checkout aisle, because it's right there and it's an impulse purchase, people would leave the movie theater and go buy the soundtrack. There was also this amazing thing that I found in an issue of Variety where Jerry Bruckheimer and Don Simpson are talking about how they have perfected the formula of soundtrack making. They're the pair behind Flashdance, and I don't think Footloose was theirs, but they're doing all of these big blockbuster movies with huge soundtracks. Beverly Hills Cop.
Yes.
And they're talking in this piece in early 85 about the piece is key to the success of the Beverly Hills Cop soundtrack and the Miami Vice soundtrack. And they're talking about, we've figured out the formula. We start, instead of putting the soundtrack together at the last minute, we now build the soundtrack into the making of the movie. And you're going to see it with our next movie, Top Gun.
That could probably be a whole book topic in itself.
I think we have a book topic for you now. Yeah.
I'm a little tired of talking about soundtracks.
Well, this was great. It was the book is a great document of the year 1984.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, just lead everything that leads into these certain episodes that happened in the year 1984 and what happened beyond it. It's a great document.
So
it's a great document piece. So thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
All right, take care.
All right.
You too.
The book is Can't Slow Down, How 1984 Became Pop's Blockbuster Year. The author is Michaelangelo Matos, and we just talked with him. We went through a number of topics, a lot we didn't talk about, but it was kind of cool to kind of get his insight into how he picked his topics, and I learned a lot.
I did too. What he found significant in 1984, a lot of things I didn't know so much about. I really enjoyed reading more about the breakdancing and the history of breakdancing and all the troops.
84 was a great year. In this book, he covered everything from radio to movies and hip hop and Springsteen and Michael Jackson and of course Lionel Richie. You can't slow down when you're talking about Lionel Richie, culminating in the Live Aid. Perfect for our podcast. Let's wrap this up. We can't slow down, but we are going to stop. So until next time, this is Dave.
This is Holly.
Check you later.
Over and out.